And I think we're live. Proper episode 2 of the Geek Book Club. Technically episode 3. I mean, we've recorded 3 of these live streams. We've talked about 3 individual books. I guess that's... We'll have to sort out our naming. At some point, maybe I'll go back and I'll just rename everything like episode 1, 2, 3 instead of having an episode 0. What do you think?
It's whatever works. I mean, I just feel like we can just do it kind of the Star Trek TOS way of just having just the 2 pilots. You know?
Yeah. See, we had a 2-parter pilot instead of an episode 1 going to episode 3. It's episode 0 going to episode 1. Thank you very much for tuning in, or for watching this, or for listening to this. I'm Juan Carlos Bagnell, and joined by my delightful co-host, who is much thinner than his profile photo, Mr. Andrew Wallace. What are you drinking tonight? I've got a Guinness Golden Ale.
I've got the Logboat Brewing Company Missouri Lager. You know, ooh. I don't think this is helping with my thinness at all, but you know,
I'm supposed to be on a diet too. I've been trying to get camera ready, and if you catch me on Twitter, like I feel like I just need to eat an entire batch of kettle corn and drink a beer. That's how I'm gonna get camera ready.
Don't worry, I did sacrilege and had a couple of things of Cheez-Its, so
a couple things of okay. When you say a couple of things of Cheez-Its, did you mean you had a couple boxes of Cheez-Its, or you had a handful of Cheez-Its? What is your
Let's go with the handfuls, you know.
We'll go with a handful, and then we'll tell increasingly more absurd lies later on. But we've got a terrific book. This is one of the most exciting books to talk about I think I've read in recent memory. This book actually came to me by my sister and my brother-in-law. My sister Christina, and they turned me on to Ken Liu. Ken Liu, not only as a translator of Chinese literature, but then also a very accomplished science fiction author in his own regard. So I would also highly recommend, as sort of a tangent to the book that we're talking about today, what is it called? The Paper Menagerie, which is a collection of short stories where every short story somehow manages to make you feel the most hopeful for humanity that you've ever felt, at the same time as he's twisting a knife in your heart and you just want to cry. Because it's just beautiful prose, which is what is so exciting about this month's book, The 3-Body Problem. I really wish I had a sound effects board with like a really good trumpet.
Yeah. Well, I can go get my trombone out, you know.
I play the clarinet, so I can't help us there at all, unfortunately. The 3-Body Problem, an incredibly unique take on a very tropey science fiction setup. Andrew, so so first of all, before we get into the story, I actually read a pulped dead tree version of the story. You tackled the audiobook.
Yep. It was interesting because it was also kind of a performance as well. Like there was that aspect of it. If you've watched before, you know that I enjoy audiobooks. And it was interesting to see, because we were talking earlier about how there are a bunch of footnotes in the print copy, which we didn't really get at all in the audiobook. So Wikipedia was my best friend on things I was not familiar with, because this book is a very theory dense book.
It really is. It's almost like the first. We say almost like the first half of the novel is just setting up the world to accomplish the mystery, which then, once they've explained all of the history, all of the technical aspects, all of the exposition, there's like this roller coaster descent into the actual meat of the story. And I guess we should start off. This book follows an individual scientist. I'm gonna apologize profusely throughout the show, but I might as well apologize up front. I'm going to be terrible at saying the names of the characters in this story. I have to. Yeah, I have no connection, unfortunately, to the Chinese language to help make that less awkward.
Wang Miao, I believe.
Wang Miao
Yeah, yeah,
would be, or Wang Miao,
Wang
again,
Miao.
depending on if you hold to a soft A or a rounder A. But he is a scientist, and he does a lot of research on nanomaterials, and he starts getting pulled into an investigation of other scientists who are dying and committing suicide under very mysterious circumstances. And it
Mm-hmm.
leads him into not only just the investigation with an amazing detective character, Dashi,
Oh.
Big Shi, who we'll talk about in a bit, talk about more in depth in just a bit. But as he gets pulled into this investigation, he stumbles his way into an almost cult-like religious fervor of science and research, and then that also draws him into a very mysterious video game, which is describing a very interesting sort of solar arrangement of a planet with three suns, which is where the book gets its title, The Three
Mm-hmm.
Body Problem. And then from there, things just kind of snowball and go haywire, and everything is crazy and exciting and mysterious. And immediately, one of the things we were talking about before we jumped into the podcast, just it was incredibly refreshing to read a science fiction story from a perspective that I'm not very familiar with. I'm very familiar with like Hong Kong cinema, but I can't say that I've read a lot from the Chinese perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
this was, like I said, a wholly unique take on a story that I think we've seen done, a number of times. Obviously, we've seen this story done very poorly a number of times too. Mystery, secret, underground cult, science, and I kept imagining, the comparisons between movies like Prometheus and Alien Covenant. Just going, this was such a smarter way to tell a story about science than the sort of anti-science science fiction that we currently have in media today.
And it's so believable the way they come about it, because you feel like a lot of, like, with the game, for example, that you have to wear a V suit, a virtual reality
Right.
suit that basically puts you there, and I mean that's not very far away today, even, and it's everything that they accomplish in this book feels attainable in our current world almost.
Yeah, a very practical, a very grounded and a very practical style of storytelling. Again, science fiction that doesn't need to be outlandish. And I really respect that decision not to try and place this in some future society or in some like Ready Player One kind of world, because what the characters discover is such a kick to the head. It is such a disruptive force upon human society that
Mm-hmm.
had human society already been outlandish, it would have made this a farce. It would have made this a melodrama. And instead, what we get by grounding the story and really, I mean, there are a few little science fiction-y elements that are fantastical. I mean, you can't escape that if you're telling a science fiction story. But because we've grounded it and we explain the rules of this world. So I guess one of the important places to start is just how nonlinear this story is. One of the characters that Wang interacts with is an older woman who grew up during the Cultural Revolution of China, and the book dedicates a significant amount of time to explaining her backstory, explaining her origin. So you get that historical grounding of what were probably terrible events to live through, and then that's sort of the juxtaposition of the comfortable society that we face today, but what could change in our society if the three body problem, the game, is foretelling our future. And
Well, and there's a lot of parallels with her life and what's happening, because things.
if you can tell, we're trying to manage like major spoilers in a way that doesn't like completely ruin parts of the book.
Right.
I think we're gonna have like a spoiler section at the end of this podcast.
Oh,
but
yeah.
But for those of you who are kind of kicking this off and listening to this right now, there's a reason why we're kind of building up to part of the description here, because this book unfolds for what was for me some fairly unpredictable ways that I
Mhm.
would hate to ruin. Even just saying that, isn't that the kind of the screwy thing though? Even just saying that, it's kind of like when someone says like, "Oh, this movie's got a great twist." I won't tell you what the twist is, but it's got a twist, and you're like, that
Mhm.
still kind of ruins
Yeah,
experience
well,
of
it's like a Sixth Sense sort of thing, you know.
right.
Well, and it's what I was saying with this one. It's pretty interesting because China starts out as, you know, the Cultural Revolution, how that climate is so different and anti-science, and then we go to the other side where Wang Miao is. China has supported science again, and so there's a lot of themes in how culture can and thinking can change radically in relatively
Yeah,
short amount of time.
and this was a cultural perspective that I'm woefully undereducated on. You know, like growing up. So growing up in a public high school in the United States, in my junior year of high school, you have a United States history class, and my senior year of high school, I wasn't able to take AP World History, and by about halfway through the year, the World History normal class had caught up to the American history class. So there's only 200 years of American history. Or, there's thousands of years of world history,
Oh
and we
man.
both caught up at around like World War II, and so that means we had to skip whole chapters of our textbooks that were focused on like what the Chinese population went through during the sort of this communist uprising.
Oh yeah, and
And
one
we
oh
have some
sorry.
of those parallels in today's society where some facts are okay and some facts aren't. And so they start, people are being executed because some of the things that they're researching don't jive with the communist ethic that they're trying to instill in this population. And I've already forgotten the female character's name.
Lao Wencia.
I'm going to say that is absolutely accurate and correct.
That was the benefit of the audiobook. Was
I'm sure he's actually said the names. I should have actually at least done a section of this on the audiobook. But that's actually because you were saying you had to look some of the stuff up on Wikipedia. One of the things that I think Ken Liu has done an amazing job in the translation of this is almost every single page has a footnote or a series of references to try and explain some of the cultural significance or just the differences in Western thought versus Eastern thought. And so it's extremely well annotated. And in fact, Ken Liu starts to feel a little like a Ken Burns voice throughout this science fiction novel. I mean, he's taking his duties as the translator so seriously that you get this wonderful representation of topics and history that I was very unfamiliar with. So it doesn't leave you feeling the impact of where the story goes is so much more accessible. And so when you were saying that you didn't have that access in the audiobook, how often did you find yourself having to reference, like Wikipedia? I mean, was it like I'd finish a chapter and then like, what did that mean?
Right. Honestly, most of it was during the time we spent in the 60s, a lot of it. Right. Especially because I knew going on, like, okay, this is setting up a lot of stuff. I got to make sure to understand what's going on. And a lot of it also was just geography.
Right.
Geography was the big thing for me. So I just, Wikipedia was an easy best friend for that. But yeah, I'd say it was some stuff around the Cultural Revolution, though it was the book handled it pretty well for people who aren't really familiar with it. But then with the Cultural Revolution in China, that is. But yeah, geography, hands down. It helped me get a good sense of scale. Right. Which is for it. So, yeah. Were there any maps in your book?
In maps like China is just where are these things taking place? Because it's not like New York.
Well, and you're up in Mongolia, and you're right. Like it's all over the place, and people that it's one of those things where people might not always realize how different and varying the geography of China really is. And how
So,
diverse.
well, and the populations too, because they're
Mhm.
descriptions of some of the other people that you encounter throughout the story. You know, we forget that, or we might not have the scale as appropriately, but you know, like if someone's from California, that's going to be a very different mentality than someone who's from Georgia. That is
Yes.
magnified when you look at the Chinese population, the Chinese economy, and then also just the landmass, which we call China, that humongous stretch of territory.
Mhm.
So again, the book manages to do this really beautiful job. It's a beautiful brutality, as there are
Yeah.
culture clashes within Chinese society, and then as the book unfolds, we get little hints of what China's culture, how it runs up against Western ideas. Of course, throughout this story and throughout this mystery of scientists dying, other countries are starting to poke their nose into what's happening. It's not like the rest of the world is isolated from this experience. And of course, it's not that they're a villain, but they become something of a minor speed bump in one part of the book is, you know, the United States. We would, of course, butt into Chinese society in a way that would try and affect what's happening with these characters.
Well, and you know, and I don't think this really gives away much, but you know, the Chinese military guy with the cigar,
Totally.
you know, or American. I'm sorry, American military guy with the cigar, you know. So whatever. I like how all the cultures balance out within the story. It just does it really in just a really engaging way that just draws you into the world. The world building is second to none in this.
Oh, really. And completely. And for a book that managed to surprise me on some of the turns, that didn't pull any punches. You know, there are moments that read like they could have come straight out of like a Walking Dead kind of scenario. You got attached to this character. You were really, you were really on board. You were with them, and then 10 pages later, they could betray another character, or they could be dead.
I know. I found myself multiple times going back and going, take me back 30 seconds here. What just happened?
Hold on. Hold on. and that this book really respects its audience, because some of the concepts in philosophy that they're describing, I guess let's get into the description of the game.
Yes, so, 3-body.
In the world, as Wang is trying to unravel the mystery of these suicidal and these dead scientists, one of the things that he gets tapped into is this virtual reality game called 3-body. And every time he enters this virtual reality game world, he's transported to a mysterious planet which is using metaphors of Earth history. So different periods of development are represented by Earth historical counterparts. So if a society has built itself up into like the age of Greek architecture, it's represented as sort of a Grecian society. It starts out with the pyramids, a very ancient society, but capable of building these amazing monuments. And the people of this game world are facing a planet that is completely unpredictable in its weather and its solar conditions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because they can't predict the whole I guess the whole point of the game is to be able to create a calendar to accurately predict the orbit of the 3 suns.
Three suns. And the book does this again for someone who only studied through like high school level physics. I made it through some college calculus, but I'm the math on this would actually be above my pay grade.
Yeah,
the book does a great job of explaining the difficulties of trying to map. So like if you had a binary star system, the book explains, you can actually do the math on what the relationship between 2 suns and planets would be. But for some reason, when we introduce a third sun, there really isn't any math that can properly predict or explain what's happening. And so the society in this game is facing conditions where if they can see all 3 suns at once, it either means they're way too close to 3 stars and the entire surface of the planet's going to get scorched, or they're way too far away from 3 stars, and the entire surface of the planet's going to freeze.
And how do these people who live in 3-body combat this and have evolved to deal with this? They can dehydrate themselves and hydrate themselves, like, and roll themselves up, you know. So like they have these dehydrators. So if it's going to be super cold, and they or their planet's going to be, or the world, the 3-body is going to be in a state that really can't support life, well, they can dehydrate themselves and store themselves for later, which is pretty convenient.
I mean, yeah, you almost kind of like, I kind of wish I had that just as
yeah. Well, think of how long you'd live like that too, because a lot of these characters, like, they'll get Copernicus all the way up, you know, 1,000 years after his era, because, you know, because you're
and that should be explained is when Wang joins this game, players are playing this game all over the world. And you take on sort of like you take on like a game name, an avatar, and he chooses Copernicus. And so when he starts interacting with the characters, the NPCs of this game world, they recognize him throughout these different eras of time. And the game, again, in this beautifully brutal kind of description, where they think they're working with the player characters to try and determine, like, hey, can we actually predict what the next nice era is? Because if we could just say, you know, with some certainty, you know, for the next year, we're going to have terrible conditions, so everyone dehydrate and we'll be safe. And then after that, for 6 months, we'll be able to rehydrate and be okay. That becomes what the player is interacting with. But at the end of every one of these sessions, the book describes like the game's kill screen, where it's like, oh, and society 194 of this era has been destroyed, and all of the people died. And so we thank you for playing the 3-body problem, and please log in again. And when when Wang does, it could be like 1,000 years later or tens of thousands of years later. It's kind of impossible to know, because the society gets wrecked every single time he joins the game.
Well, and there are other people playing too, so it's constantly going. You know, that's one thing too, is just the fact. That's one thing that was a little unclear to me while I was listening to the book, was who, because they say several times that certain people are players, but and they mention, oh, well, I can tell there's actually somebody who's playing this, but that was a little bit unclear to me. So it kind of felt like he was just playing a big PvE WoW campaign. You know?
So I kind of felt like there was probably more separation, that each iteration of this game world was unique to an actual human player, and that they weren't really interacting amongst other real people, but that what the game was doing, there's sort of there's so many almost references that we can make. Like, there's a part of this that feels a little like a Ready Player One, you know, the adventure of exploring this virtual world or this virtual space. Then there's a part of this book which feels a lot like The Last Starfighter, where I think the purpose of the game is to vet who is smart enough to understand the ramifications of the problem, knowing that the problem can't be solved in a meaningful way, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, so that does make sense.
So it's less about, so like there are major points in the game where, you know, Wang as Copernicus will introduce a piece of information to a culture or one of these civilizations, and that's like a level, like that's a level up, like, oh, we've achieved this piece of knowledge, and now we can end this era of the 3-body civilization. Thank you for logging in, and we can move on to the next era the next time you decide to play the game.
And there's some creative things, are like how to compute while they're trying to figure out, the problem of this, like how they compute it is really creative in this world too, where I never would.
We have to talk about the army.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
A computer, so an army, a physical army of people being a macro computer, basically.
Yep.
Like, I've never come across anything like that in any of the sci-fi reading that I've done, and it was just
So
fascinating.
how many soldiers do they pull? It's something like 30 million or something.
Something,
like
yeah. It's like basically if you got the entire population of like the United States.
And so what's amazing
more,
is
or less.
Well, I don't think it's the entire population. There are 300 million people in the United States. I think,
was it like 15 million or something like that they said? It was whatever. It was a humongous number, like a
Andrew,
ludicrous number of people.
all I'm saying is that you're totally wrong about the number of people in the United States. That's all I'm trying.
I probably am. That's
why
fine.
do you hate America? Is all I want to get an answer to, but we can talk about that later. So no, what the book does is the three body civilization is trying to compute the mathematical formula that might be able to explain the orbit and the three stars of this solar system. And they devise a method of computation by using humans holding flags. So someone holding the flag up is a 1, someone putting their flag down is a 0. And the book actually takes the time. It's not just that they say, oh, and they make a CPU out of humans. The book actually takes the time to describe, like if one person's holding up a flag and 2 other people are reacting, this is like NAND. If one person is working and 3 other with other colored flags are responding, this is like your RAM. People who are actually writing down the results, that's like your hard drive. This description is on point for what the exact functions of a chipset are, not just 1 or 0, yes or no compute, not like Tron, like you've got the bit in Tron.
No.
They take millions of people and they describe in detail what the entire army would actually be responsible for or tasked with to make a human computer. And that, it's this wonderfully powerful computational space, even though each individual soldier is only responsible for a very easy and a very straightforward job. Hold up flag, put down flag. And it's just this, again, it's this beautiful metaphor for something that we take for granted. This philosophical metaphor for something that, we've got a supercomputer in our pocket right now. But if like a Mongolian Genghis Khan era army wanted to carry out, incredibly in-depth, complicated mathematical computations, that this could be a method for them to achieve that prior to any kind of mechanical computational device.
Well, and what kind of repercussions would that have on a society that has that computational understanding that early on,
right,
in civilization?
I mean, imagine giving that kind of metaphor to the ancient Egyptians.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's explained by the Stargate ghouls and all that, So, but no. But seriously, it's like the Library of Alexandria, even,
right?
So it was really fascinating how they did it, and it also took them a long time to do this problem. So one thing about this game too is you can speed up time, right. Because civilizations, with everything, it would just take forever and you die from starvation in this game if you did it in real time. But I was actually honestly surprised that the armies didn't, get burned to a crisp during a chaotic era or something.
Well, and that's part of the description. Is so the world is broken up into, the history of this world is broken up into stable eras where the planet is orbiting only one star, conditions are super nice, they're able to be productive. And then there are chaotic eras where the weather conditions and the solar conditions are completely unpredictable. It doesn't mean that the world is uninhabitable. It just means they have no idea of what their world is going to resemble day to day. The sun might not ever rise. The sun might rise. 2 suns might rise. No suns might rise.
Sun could come up and then go back down.
And then they describe, like, if we see there's this bad omen, this terrible omen, it could be the worst thing ever if we saw 3 tiny stars in the sky. Well, that's because you're too far away and your world's going to freeze. Or if we see one gigantic ball of light, it's because all 3 suns are lined up and the gravitational forces of the triumvirate of stars affecting this planet could rip all of the material off of the surface of the planet. I mean, it's again, it's this incredibly brutal, but so on point. There's never a moment where you don't have a feeling of, you don't have a sense of what the consequences might be. And so at each time that they describe a terrible occurrence of what ends one of these civilizations, it's a shock, but it's so grounded in a scientific idea of gravity and history and science, astrophysics, that it's not just magic. It's not just like, oh, and something terrible happens and everyone dies, or like a total like Deus Ex Machina kind of ending. It's like you always have this hook. You always have this attachment to relatively hard scientific science, hard study, that you're not just like, again, it's not a cheap surprise, it's not a cheap thrill. It's not like in a horror movie where the boyfriend grabs the girl by the shoulder and they do that stupid stabbing sound effect just to give you a jump scare. This book treats the reader with enough respect to say, like, okay, there is some scientific basis for what it is that we're trying to describe, so go with us on this journey, because the payoff is totally going to be worth it.
It's true. Like they handle going down the rabbit hole really well, just as far as like, you don't think that it can go any farther, and they just they go for it. It's one of the most unique sci-fi reads that I've had really. And plus I'd love to play that game in real life. It'd be fun,
I mean, I really would like to give that a sense. From Vicente George in our live chat, too much science for me at this time. I mean, like, I don't think this is a book to take lightly. I think there's something, this is a dense read. It's not a difficult read, but it's not one of those books where, when you're reading a book and you realize like you've made it to the end of the page, but you didn't really absorb what your eyes scanned over. There is no moment of wasted time in this story. There's no fat. Everything in this book is necessary for everything that comes after what you've just read. And I really, again, it comes down to something like respect. When a TV show or a movie does this, where everything that they give you pays off, that to me is the sign of a writer who is really respecting the relationship that he has with his audience. And this book, I think, achieves that, where anytime I found myself like just skimming, it's like I had to go back. I have to take this page over again. The information that I just missed was crucial to the next part of this story, the next part of an explanation, the next part of a setup, or the payoff to a setup. And I couldn't even let myself off the hook. I mean, like, I finished this book 2 days before we did this show, and it was because, in part, like, it took me a bit longer to read through this story than it would, like Arthur C. Clarke, where I'm wholly familiar with his writing style, and it's okay if I kind of glaze over some parts of it. Isaac Asimov, like, his character exposition is usually terrible, so it's okay if you skip that because you really want to get to the more like logic puzzles of his stories. This book had both beautiful and brutal characterizations and character emotional engagement, but at the same time you also needed to be invested in the scientific world that he was building and the history that he was describing.
Well, and one thing they describe hold on. We'll hold this for the spoiler side. Sorry, it's one of those things.
Before we get into spoilers, I mean, there are a couple of, we mentioned briefly the detective.
Yes. He is kind of the most levity. He's kind of he has the most humor in the story.
Completely. And again, in a way where this book needed some levity, but there's this like this time-honored tradition of the Chinese policeman or the Chinese detective in Chinese cinema, where they can be used as a punchline, but they also still need to be effective at their jobs. And that's what Dashi represented to me. I mean, like, if you ever watched a movie like Ip Man or Bruce Lee, classic Bruce Lee films, there is always one of the, or Jackie Chan too. I mean, some of his super cop stuff, like he takes that trope of the bumbling policeman or the bumbling detective, but then makes the whole movie about that character as opposed to that character being a supporting character. So Dashi is this amazingly intuitive and effective police officer who is also brought into this investigation of these suicidal scientists. So he brings these tremendous insights, this amazing character analysis that the reader can kind of absorb through his character. At the same time as every single time he has an interaction with an authority figure, he does everything he can to figuratively poke that character in the eye.
Oh yeah. You know? Well, and he another function of his character is with a book that's so that gets so into the weeds on the details of the science and physics. He brings the readers, much like he brings the scientists, back down to the real world and to the contextual awareness of what's going on.
You're off exploring some weird fantasy land with three suns. I'm dealing with the fact that there was a dead body in my district that I need to be able to explain. Yeah. So why don't we take a look at that, and you can keep playing in your VR stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and the way he was probably my favorite character in the whole novel.
I agree.
Like they pay him off.
A character that totally could have been, you know, a trope or a cliche or something like that. And again, this book at least still respects you that he's not just there for a laugh, and he's also not some omniscient, again, a Deus Ex Machina. I just come up with the answer whenever it's convenient for the book. He's guarded. He has information that Wang doesn't have, but he's also a collaborator, but he could be an enemy. I mean, there's so much nuance that's happening that even a one-off side character that, again, could have been just a trope or could have been a completely throwaway interaction. There is meaning there. There is a richness of storytelling that he doesn't even let a joke character off the hook. That character still needs to contribute to the story in a meaningful way.
And they make a point when they introduce him to make you
as
not
unlikable
like him
as possible.
Yeah. Like they talk about how, you know, he what was it, like he used extreme, you know, techniques as a cop, you know, to get the job done, and you're kind of like, what, you know?
And they make a point, and not just with him describing that he's like some kind of badass. The other characters that surround him are constantly shushing him. They don't really respect him, but they need him. I mean, again, it's this just. All of these characters could be completely disposable, but this is still rich interaction. This is still worthwhile interaction. And that's just really exciting. Way too often. I went off this deep dive before we started doing this podcast on like just terrible pulp zombie novels. And like you would have these interactions, like there's a cop and he's in one chapter of a book, and then that cop never comes back and the interaction was useless. And there wasn't really any. So I mean, it's like I just read 30 pages with this one character in the book that just totally wasted my time. But you needed to explain something expository, and that's how we got to this point. Dashi so easily could have fallen into that trap, but instead, again, like you were saying, he becomes. I think he becomes one of the favorite characters of this book, and that's by design. There's an arc for this character. You're supposed to hate him at the beginning, and he wins you over by the end, and that's with purpose.
Oh yeah, well, you know, I will say, oddly enough, you know who the people, very very few people in this book who don't really have a purpose is Wang Yao's family. Because we're going through and they talk about his family, and then about a third of the third of the way through the book, we never see them again.
Of the way into the book, they don't. I mean, there's not even a point describing in like a fraction of a quantity. So that's actually, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'd completely forgotten that they even existed.
I know. So, I don't think we got descriptions of them.
So Andrew, you have a significant other. You have a dog, or you have two dogs?
No, my girlfriend has two dogs.
Your girlfriend has two dogs.
Yeah.
So I'm going to write a story where in the first 20 pages of that story, I establish that you have a girlfriend and two dogs. Then I'm going to send you on this crazy adventure where you don't sleep. You're constantly driving to crime scenes. You're interacting with a weird science cult that has built a video game that treats this world like it's everything a religion. Else. And I'm just never, ever going to mention that you have a girlfriend and two dogs, and they're never going to call. So
I know, they're never going to have any impact on me for the rest of existence. You know? Like,
no, I'm just going to take it for granted that when you go missing and you don't show up at work anymore and you get caught up with a police and military investigation of a weird religious-y, science-y cult, that your girlfriend's just never going to call. Like,
she's just going to be like, I've seen that Waco thing before.
You know, Andrew's gone as per usual.
Yeah. I beamed back up to the mothership. You know? It's just, I was just like, I was going through it, and by the time I got about to the last fourth of the book, I was like, are they going to bring these people back? So who knows? We might see them in the next book because there are have all three books come out now? Or is this completed?
No, actually, that's a good question that I did not do my homework on. You say something else insightful because I'm mildly intoxicated and I'm going to look up Three Body Problem in a web browser. This is terrible podcasting right now.
Don't worry, I'm like looking straight down, at my notes here. Yeah, well, and they introduced also an idea of physics in like the laws of physics are constant. Mm-hmm. But what if they aren't constant depending on where in the universe you are? So, if you think about it, like the laws of physics, like they talk about how, I forgot what the exact analogy that they had. Was it with like drips? No, it was like paper and poking holes in it, I believe, the analogy, where I'm sure I'm going to butcher the analogy, but essentially from your point of view, from everything that you can perceive, like for us, like we're just assuming that the laws of physics as we have is just constant, and it's just the way the universe is. Well, what if just outside of what we are perceiving, it turns out like we're the oasis,
right?
And what
and again, their metaphor for this is wonderful because there's a sciencey version of that metaphor where one of the characters is describing like a two-dimensional world. And what if you drew a circle, but if you were three-dimensional, you could see outside and you could see how things were different. And then Dashi comes in and it's like, well, let's say you were a chicken.
Yeah.
And if you were a chicken and you had this data, you could say, well, this is the way that life is supposed to be lived. But then that could change the very next day if the next day is like Thanksgiving and all of your chicken cohorts are going to be slaughtered for a meal. So it does look like the trilogy was completed. So
perfect.
The first two books were out in 2008. The third book was published in 2010. But I think they have different translators, which now really? I'm curious if the tone of those books is able to remain consistent, because I think one of the things that's so vital about this story is the voice of the author carried through the voice of the translator to help dumb Westerners like me come into a story from a Chinese perspective.
Yeah.
Because I've only been to China once, and it was for a very brief period of time. But there was significant culture shock, just manners and how you interact with people and how you take public transit and how you handle airports and restaurants. And there's a directness to interactions that, as a Californian, let alone, like if I were from, living in New York, as a Californian, that you're just not prepared for until you encounter it. And so if that voice is different for the other two books, I wonder if I would have the same experience in reading this story. That's really interesting.
That is interesting too. I will say the person who is reading the audiobook, I originally, a lot of people might not know, you can actually get audiobooks from your local library, most likely.
Right on.
And
support your local library is a mission statement for this podcast.
Unfortunately, the app was terrible that I was using, so I ended up having to go with Audible. But either way, it was the same voice, and I really think the voice is a little too American accenty
that makes sense
for it a little bit. That kind of threw me out, but that was also the performance side rather than the content side. He could do the voice as good as just.
Well, and again, that's kind of interesting because in my brain, because I didn't really do anything with audiobooks. I really did just try and hold to the paper version of this story. And even for some reason, like I felt like I need to read this book as a book, not as an ebook. And I don't know why my brain went there. But one of the things that I think really helped in terms of imagination was just for how much I love Chinese and Hong Kong cinema. When characters interact with each other in Chinese films, there is a sense of just how direct those interactions are and how, again, how brutal some of those interactions can be, because then you also expect that like at some point they're going to do some amazing fight choreography. So you've got to raise the stakes. But when characters would talk to each other or when characters were being interrogated, there was that sense that my brain was trying to recreate some of the scenes that I've seen from Chinese films. The very close interactions, the more presentational or proscenium blocking, people throwing fingers into chests and accusations, and even sometimes compliments are delivered in a way that to a Westerner might feel kind of backhanded,
Outside
that to me was kind of in the back of my head. And I think it would have been disruptive to the story if someone who sounded like me was trying to read this book to me. It's not what I would want.
Right. When I got a lot of a, especially outside of the world of Three Body and the cultish sort of deal, I got a very big sense of a noir sort of, almost like the bad cut of Blade Runner with the monologues, where I kind of got that feeling, especially whenever they're coming across people who have either been killed or killed themselves, and I got that vibe a lot, especially because you get in those old films, you get a lot of that intense one-on-one character moments too. So
all of that heightened drama, all of the heightened stakes. As a quick tangent, have you ever seen the movie Brick with Joseph Gordon-Levitt?
No, I've wanted.
It's funny
to see
that you should say that, because like the idea of the gumshoe detective story, that someone gets pulled into a world that's bigger than they know. I totally got a small sense of that reading. Again, I would say about through the first third of Wang's story, that had a kind of a similar vibe to it. Another piece of the story unravels or is unfolded before his eyes. And what does that mean? The ramifications. Now he's got to go even deeper down the rabbit hole. It's something like that totally makes sense that, if you were having like a film noir kind of experience with that's totally on point.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I guess, did we want to get into the spoiler section?
We probably should. And I don't want to completely ruin this book, but
I don't either.
I'm going to flat out tell you, because I have no idea how long we'll talk spoilers here.
I'm waving my arms for spoilers.
Well, I was going to say, if you think you want to read this book, turn this show off now.
Yeah, and have a beer.
Come back to this show after you're finished reading the book. Seriously, I hate movie podcasts that do nothing but regurgitate the plot of a story. And then the hero does this, and then the bad guy says that, and then this happens, and then that happens. Because when we describe some of these things, the way that this information is delivered in the book is so special. It's so unique.
It's organic.
And it's with such a unique combination of voices that to have us just regurgitate parts of it, we do a tremendous disservice to the story. So again, if you're planning on reading it, shut us off now. I see 6 viewers watching us on the live stream. I'm going to assume that you guys have either read this or you were not expecting to read this and you just want to hear our thoughts on it.
Well, hey, we recommend you read it too, because I mean, what was it this summer? President Obama was reading it. They made a whole thing about it. Or former President Obama, that is. But
so,
you know,
so we're basically pretty much just like the former president of the United States.
You know, yes.
I mean, just as smart, just as charismatic, just as handsome. We're both winners. Again, another reason why, Andrew, you need to get a better profile pic, because you look way better than your profile pic.
I just shrink it, you know.
You just like stretch it vertically, you know.
I look like
Okay. I see one person. One person jumped out and another person jumped in. That person's true. Entering spoiler zone. Apologies if this ruins the book for you, because Andrew and I need to talk about this, because we spent a month with this book. So in the game of the 3-body problem, you have these artificial people that live on this planet. Ye Wenji discovers through her exile after the Cultural Revolution that her father was a physicist, and she gets exiled to this radio tower. She discovers that there is a method of communication that we can utilize our sun, to radically increase the signal power of our radio equipment.
Yeah, we're basically a beacon.
And we can turn our sun into a beacon. And upon doing that, she actually gets a reply. And so this is in the 70s that she does this.
No,
in
that's
the 1970s.
The book starts out in the mid 60s, and then it goes forward by, I think, about 5 years. So
this might be the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
So each of these replies is taking years in coming back from her using the sun as a beacon. But because it's only taking years, we get a pretty good sense of how far away these replies are coming. And the fictional characters of this video game are actual representations of a species of alien known as the Trisolarans.
In the in the Alpha Centauri?
Alpha Centauri in a 3-sun system, and they are on the lookout for a planet which might be more hospitable.
Yes. And think of how brutal and cold does a society have to be to survive in that tough of an environment?
Well, and what's amazing, without spelling it out, by the time we get into the last third of the novel and we're introduced to the Trisolarans as an actual species, as an actual entity.
From their point of view.
From their point of view, we also get these little hints that they've gone through a similar cultural revolution as to what happened in China in the 1960s. And in Ye Wenji, because she saw the death of her father, and so much of her world was taken from her in this, she becomes a sympathetic ally to the Trisolarans, in that if humanity's ever going to improve itself, maybe we could learn from extraterrestrials, or maybe the extraterrestrials will just come here and wipe us all out. And actually, in a way, maybe that's even better for the planet. And that's when we're introduced to the real religious fanaticism of this cult of people following the 3-body problem, that there are factions, the Adventists versus the redemptionists.
And the saviors.
and the saviors. So these three factions warring under this, again, this religious fervor of what it would be like to encounter an alien species. Some people really just hoping they'll come here and wipe out humanity and treat this planet with more respect. Some people hoping that they'll come here and be saviors, that they'll
because the saviors are the ones who are trying to actually solve the problem for the Tristellarians, so they can stay there.
And a whole group of people are hoping that the aliens don't come, because if we can mathematically solve the three-body problem, then they'll just live on their own planet. But again, this warring faction, and they all have resources, they all have scientists, they all have learned individuals and military tacticians at their disposal to interact amongst themselves, let alone amongst all of the governments of the world, all of the scientists of the world. And that's when we discover that the Tristellarians have not only been in communication, they have actively been participating in a campaign to reduce the effectiveness of human science.
Well, and also, we got to let everyone know, too, it's going to take them, they're on their way, and it'll take 400 years to get here. So we have we have an hour, the hourglass is slowly ticking down on us. Yeah.
But over that 400 years, they're trying to make sure, because and again, they do, when you start dealing with science fiction and they're like, oh, well, we'll just invent warp drive or something like that, we'll be there in an hour, like there's something wonderful about that in a storytelling construct. And there's also something really lazy about that in a storytelling construct, especially when the rules don't always remain consistent. And so they set up, the book sets up a rule. It sets up a rule that it's going to take the Tristellarians 400 years to get here. But what the Tristellarians explain beautifully is that humanity advances non-linearly.
Yeah, it's exponential.
That humanity advances scientifically in an exponential fashion, where the Tristellarians, their advancements have come in stages because of the number of times their civilization has been wiped out. They have to rebuild, and it becomes a very linear process for them to replicate and reduplicate the advancements of past civilizations. So they know over the course of 400 years, by the time we get there, the humans are going to wipe us out. The humans are just going to annihilate us if we show up on their doorstep 400 years from now. So they create a series of events to mess with scientists, to create conditions in which scientists will become suicidal, to alter our scientific studies, to disrupt our particle effects, because a part of this is also just the deeper understanding of matter is really going to be the next pioneer.
We can't really, they basically set it up where we cannot truly understand the subatomic level of reality. And because that's like the next leap, it's kind of like getting gunpowder or the Industrial Revolution. We can't break through that. And
TNT to the nuclear escalation of warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's so, because they're basically counting on us. It's as if they took a B-2 bomber up against a Game of Thrones army. So.
Well, and that's what they're hoping, is that they'll show up in something that we can't fight. But then that ties it all the way back to how, even when we were describing Wang's character, is he's a nanoparticle physicist. He actually represents one of the biggest threats to this alien civilization. So again, that reveal, I feel bad even just talking about it, because in the way that it plays out in the book is so important and so meaningful, that Wang understands his role in all of this, that this entire conflict is happening way above his pay grade, way outside of his frame of reference, and that he's drawn into it in a gradual discovery of different pieces. And then the whole weight of this conflict comes crashing down on his shoulders.
Yeah, and it comes crashing down when he's surrounded by people that you don't want to be in this situation. He's just kind of...
So it becomes this incredible hero journey too. Again, the most compelling heroes are flawed human individuals that are thrust into circumstances far larger than anything they could have imagined. And the book does such a phenomenal job of paying off that buildup. Again, there is no fat in this book. This book is dense, but the payoff is phenomenal. Once you finally get to the last escalation, the last quarter, the last fifth of this story, where all of the exposition is done, all of the explanations are done. The Trisolarans have a voice in this discussion. They have a voice in this conversation. And Wang finally understands his role in the galaxy.
Yes.
There's nothing, I've never experienced a story that unfolds like this. I've never experienced a story that is paid off like this in any book that I've read.
Yeah, neither have I. One I do have one question about that section from the Trisolarans' point of view is, when did they decide that they were going to do their own intergalactic reality TV show and broadcast it to the people of the Earth? Because it's like, it's kind of regular old conversations. It's not like prepped messages.
Right.
It's,
and that's what's difficult to get a beat on, is by our frame of reference, or the book's frame of Earth reference, a part of that has to be decided in what would have been our late 1960s. And the book takes place, I would say it doesn't take place modern day, but it takes place just slightly advanced of modern day for Ye Wenji's age. Her description of her modern day age to gel with her as a young woman in college during the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. Excuse me. That this all transpires over roughly a 40-year period.
True. Well, and it is a little bit in the future, just because like the V suits that they have, like the level of sophistication that they have,
but not much. I mean,
again, it's Google Cardboard 3.0,
I mean, it's Vive 2.0,
like pretty much.
If the book takes liberties with modern technology, it's by a couple years. It's not like everything's the same as modern day society and we have cell phones. They're just translucent cell phones. No,
they're just curves everywhere.
All these damn phones with their curved screens. No, I mean, the book does, just a tremendous job of like the best kinds of science fiction stories. What if we took the world that we know, the world that we live in, and we change one small thing about it? If it's going to be technology, if it's going to be culture, if it's going to be religion, if it's going to be history, that to me is always some of the most compelling, because the author can still do something fantastic. The three-body problem introduces fantastic fantasy concepts into a hard science fiction story. I don't want to spoil this, but the description of the resources of the Trisolarans to disrupt our scientific study is incredible. Again, and I had to go back. Pure fantasy.
I had to go back and basically go over that whole process, the whole section again, just to fully absorb it, because one, it's very detail steeped in science, but also just the scale. It's hard to wrap your brain around because we don't think like Trisolarans. So,
well, and that the Trisolarans have motivations, and the Trisolarans are just as selfish as people are. So, you can totally commiserate with their position. They're in a terrible position, but they introduce like magic in a way that Arthur C. Clarke would totally sign off on. Again, any technology that is so advanced, of your own point, would appear as magic. What the Trisolarans accomplish and the explanation of how they accomplish it is magic. It's silly. It's completely over the top. And yet, because of the grounding of the first half of the book, you're on board. It's you're like, yes, that sounds incredible. That sounds completely fantastic, utterly ridiculous, completely over the top. And you know what? Give me more. Like, let's do this. I'm completely ready.
I at some point in the future, I would be interested in us covering the sequel. like the next book.
I gotta give this book a little time to resonate.
Yes,
I mean,
agreed.
like I finished it. Like I said, I finished this book 2 or 3 nights ago, and I keep picking it back up. Like over the last like over the last 48 hours, especially, like I've gone back to beginning chapters of the book. I've chewed. I've gone through the Trisolaran history side of it 2 or 3 times. Like I just had to keep rereading where they were coming from, because it's a beautiful and brutal description of an alien intelligence that it's not like Star Trek. It's not just like it's rubber forehead prosthetics, but they're kind of just like us.
Right, because we don't. There's no way for us to the society to know what they look like, because they haven't said what they look like. So like, even the main character is talking about how he's like, well, I just imagined that they were bipedal based off of how this stuff's going on, you know. Yeah, that was about the paraphrase of all paraphrases, but yeah, basically.
Totally. Like the book even has like the book shrugs at you when it's trying to describe the Trisolarans.
Yeah,
it's hilarious.
I'm just imagining how they're all the blobs from Orville. They're all just like translucent gelatinous blobs.
Who's the voice of that? It's oh god, he's got a pod. Norm Macdonald. Macdonald voicing the blob on the Orville. Freaking hilarious. I love it. But I can't say enough nice things about the 3-body problem. I guess if we're gonna start kind of wrapping up this the story, first of all, I'm gonna have to send my sister and my brother-in-law an amazing fruit basket, because this is an author that I never would have found on my own.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't either.
It just wasn't really kind of tapped into his milieu. And I'm, by author, I also mean Ken Liu as the translator. I can't pronounce the actual author's name. Cixin Liu. Sixin.
Here, let me.
But the combination of these 2 voices delivers something I've never experienced before. And again, any type of alien first contact story usually gets hung up on, we're going to answer bigger questions, or what does this mean for Christianity? And what's so refreshing is the Chinese perspective on this doesn't have to step on any of the toes of that kind of philosophy. They get to completely circumvent the normal Western, well, we have to owe part of this book to talking about Jesus. Like that doesn't have to happen here. We get to completely avoid what is normally a humongous stumbling block in this kind of story.
I will say, China was pretty efficient at getting all the world together here, on the same page. Like more than that I've seen most other novels I've had, because there's all these interpersonal. They have a little bit of interpersonal conflict, but between there's really. Everyone's like, well, crap, we need to get this stuff figured out. Okay, we're on board, like really easily.
Well,
and those kids, that was like,
I like that the book at least sort of describes that multiple Earth governments have each been handling their problems on their own, and that when we get to the reveal, that there isn't so much conflict, because they're all coming together to kind of share information at this point, because they understand that the danger has exacerbated by this religious cult. So I do respect that, but there is definitely it's sort of like a Chinese pride. Like when you watch Doctor Who and the Americans are always cast as these like bumbling, running into a problem head first, cowboys.
Yeah.
And of course they fail, and then the British government and the Doctor are the ones that are really going to fix the problem. Again, because it's a British story told from a British perspective with British characters.
Right.
There is some of that jingoism happening. This is a Chinese story told from a Chinese perspective about Chinese people. So they are the heroes. And the other world governments, if they're not roadblocks, then they're just kind of irrelevant.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that works, because who knows if we ever get visited by extraterrestrials, who's to stop them from going to like Djibouti,
Right.
like it could be anywhere that actually makes that first contact, and it's a realistic thing to think. And I think it's nice. It adds more credibility, I
Oh,
feel,
completely.
especially since we have there are countless Western works on first contact.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I find it just very, very refreshing in a way that I've not been refreshed in science fiction literature in a long time.
No, totally. Well, and the ability to be taken by surprise. I
Mm-hmm.
just how nice was that? I to have kind of an idea of where the story could go. There were a couple things that I totally called in some of Wang's relationships and how parts of the story unfold. Especially once we really started getting into the game, there were a couple things like, oh, because
Yeah.
of the character names, you called yourself Copernicus. We're going to be talking about this. The omens are stars. Okay, a lot of that stuff, like you can kind of snap on and get a sense of where that's going. But then how it all completes, how it all ties together, was something that there's no twist. There's no like big
Yeah.
gotcha reveal. It's just it unfolds in a unique way. Again, for a
Yeah.
Westerner, it unfolds in a unique way that I wasn't prepared for, but I completely appreciated once I finally got through some of the heavy lifting of the first third of the story.
Right. Well, and it's kind of, I very much felt like an Alice in Wonderland vibe from
Oh,
this reading
totally.
journey. And
There's something dreamy about it and something
mhm.
unsettling. Even
Oh
even
yeah.
moments where there are like sort of happy changes in a character's life, there's still always this undercurrent of, and then terrible things will befall all of these people.
Yeah, it's like no
So
matter what, that's like the cloud is, no matter what you do now is not going to matter,
yeah.
whenever they come. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I'm really interested to see how a unified how humanity unifies to face the internal threat and the external threat, and I'm interested to see how far
So
forward the series goes.
so those are that's where we should leave off this story. What are your predictions? I know anyone who's read
Ooh.
the actual series is probably smashing their phone or their keyboard, their laptop in their face, like these yahoos who haven't even finished reading all three books. Where do you think this story goes? Do you think we actually get to the Trisolarans' arrival? And do you think humanity actually unites?
Hmm. Well, as far as the arrival, I'm wondering if the if physics, like the whole idea about, our constants in physics aren't necessarily like we might be the oasis.
Right.
And who knows, like maybe they could get here ahead of the 400-year uh, timeline that they've got, because they made that assumption based off of how we are physical constants that we
Right.
understand. So I foresee, and I think it would be a great drama would be to have them find out that they're getting there early. As far as uniting, I think that will. I think that the governments themselves will unite, but it's going to be more of there's going to be a big sort of spy espionage sort of story with going after the cultists and good diving into those beliefs, and I do think that we're going to bring something up with the saviors. I think
Yeah.
that might, I think, because like I foresee them like, because they brought in a character who basically was very, very close to solving the problem, like very close. They brought him in for maybe not very, he wasn't in the book for very long,
No.
but I foresee them like getting that to the Trisolarans, because there's also a dissident movement within their group too, because they're
Right.
dynamic. They're not all unified either. So I don't know. It's up in the air, and that's one of the things I love about it.
Okay, so my predictions. I don't think the Trisolarans arrive until book 3.
Yeah.
I think that, again, if I'm trying to predict what's happening, book 2 is actually more about human division. That
Yeah. I can
forces
see
on
that.
Earth will be working to divide that again, kind of like what we see with this like sort of ongoing debate about things like fake news and Facebook doing
Ooh.
business with the Russians, that book 2 will be focused more on that internal struggle of humanity to try and become a unified force against this. While some people don't believe that anything could arrive, that these aliens don't exist, that it's all a conspiracy, other people are way on the other extreme where they want these aliens to arrive to either lead us or exterminate us.
Mm-hmm.
That so many people in the middle as pawns of these various forces in the earth. So that would be my prediction. And now I need to read the other books to see how wrong I am, because I think another thing about this author is anything that I would predict from this point of the story is woefully inadequate for where I feel this voice could carry us through just different analysis of philosophy. That's another thing. This book builds its own philosophy, and I need to know now, does this voice actually maintain through 2 other books, or does this author start to get bogged down in his voice or in this description or in this philosophy?
Well, I wonder if they're going to stick with the same characters that we follow in this first book.
I don't see how they could. I think at some point,
yeah, it's too big now.
Yeah, it's huge.
So, yeah, because at that point he's just going to be working on his nanotechnology so they can build a space elevator as quick as possible.
Right.
Yeah. So, but you don't want the story taking place from like the premiers and presidents of, because that's boring. You gotta have nitty gritty. I hope that the cop is still in it though, because best character in the book.
Well, and I think there could be something really compelling about what does this world, a world where people actually do know of an alien intelligence, what does this world look like 50 years in the future? So that then parallels the Ye Wenji storyline of growing up as a young woman during the Cultural Revolution, flash forward 40 or 50 years. Now, do we have a world where it's sort of like 2020 to 2070?
Yeah.
Before we get to the 2400, the 25th century, when the Trisolarans actually arrived. So many, again, now, like, what's hilarious is like all of this, while I desperately want to read the next 2 books, there's a part of me that just wants to go right back to page 1 of this book, so I'm better prepared for what the next 2 stories actually have. Like, I need to be as grounded in this world as possible so that I know where this thing could possibly go.
I hope that they don't go with the War of the Worlds route, where like our microbes, that we have here.
It's not that. You know what I'm actually really worried about is, do we start asking big questions that we can't answer?
Like Lost.
That's why I brought up. Well, Lost is actually a really good point because of Damon Lindelof. How disappointed I was in movies like Prometheus and Alien Covenant, where instead of telling a compelling story where the characters can ask big questions, but the actual focus of the story is on completing something, you get hung up on the big questions, and then that sort of derails the plot of the film. Like, if you look at Prometheus and then you look at a movie like 2001: A Space Odyssey, they actually have a lot of parallels. They ask big questions and they make big assumptions about the creation of humanity. And they're all kind of intelligent designy, right?
Right.
2001, the monolith comes down, trains all the monkeys. That's actually where we get society. That's kind of an intelligent design idea.
Oh, yeah.
Prometheus asks the same questions, but then takes for granted the actual adventure or exploration. So in 2001: A Space Odyssey, you can ask big questions about the nature of humanity. You can ask big questions about the nature of creation. If an alien intelligence created us, what does that mean when we destroy one of our own creations, HAL, the computer? And does an alien intelligence that created us have the right to pull our plug like we pulled the plug on HAL? Those are all humongous philosophical questions, but at the end of the day, the movie is, can we get to Jupiter? It's an adventure film. Alien Prometheus takes all of that for granted. You know, it's like one scene,
Oh.
like, oh, we're gonna go on this fantastic adventure. The next scene, and we're here.
Oh, I know. Oh, that. Well, and yeah, I haven't seen Alien Covenant, but I kind of got a vibe about how
I have a big problem. Not like we need to like sidetrack this podcast overly, but I really feel like Alien Covenant is a very anti-science story. When you look at the original Alien, bad things happen to people who are very good at their jobs. They're not scientists, they're miners on a mining expedition, but you know, something bad happens and Ripley follows protocol. Someone is quarantined. Ripley does her job and she's very good at it. The characters in Alien Covenant are very bad scientists to be on a scientific expedition.
Just like Prometheus.
Just like Prometheus. Like they draw conclusions and they act in ways that I don't feel respected scientists would act, and so they're not very good at what they do, and that's necessary for the plot, because if at any point those characters were good at their jobs, then the plot would not have been able to move forward the way that it was constructed, which means to me the entire story is completely faulty. The entire story is completely insane. And so not that I think that Three Body is going to run into that trap, but if you get overly hung up on the philosophy of the world, or you get overly hung up on some of these big questions for humanity, then the story takes a back seat. And that's my fear, is that the story doesn't really get finished because of the philosophy or because of these big magical questions.
Yeah, agreed. That could be. Yeah,
it's a fear, and it's a completely unfounded one because we haven't read the next two books.
Right? Yeah, you know, it's. You know, it's nice though, because we can't take this part for granted, because then by the time we've read them, then we can't ever go back to the speculative points. So yeah, we gotta like it when we got it.
So that's the Three Body problem. I really want to thank my sister and my brother-in-law for recommending this author and this translator, Ken Liu.
Yes.
I can't recommend his writings enough, because this has completely reinvigorated my sort of passion for finding new science fiction. Three Body Problem, published in 2008. It's a winner of a Hugo Award. You can find it at your local library. It's an old enough book now that if you haven't stumbled upon it on your own science fiction reading adventures, that it's completely accessible. I went out and actually purchased a Dead Tree Pulp version of the book. I think I would maybe, from listening to your experiences, I think I would maybe recommend a printed version of this if you're not as familiar with Chinese history over the last century.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. If you do the audiobook, you definitely, during some of those technical bits, will want to go back. And that's one thing we're seeing it will help. As far as whenever you got into the noir sort of all that, that's where you get into the meat and potatoes of the audiobook experience, I'd say.
Well, and it sounds like you enjoyed the performance. Just some of the history and some of the technical stuff was a little more difficult to chew through. Yeah. Well, folks, this was a joyous read for me. I you know, it's like, do we want to even come up with scores? Like, this is a highly recommend, 2 thumbs up on a scale of 17 to 84. I give it a 78. I don't know. I'd say it's I don't know. It's just so unique that it's hard to describe even like how to rate it, because there's nothing really else that's truly like it that I've encountered. That I've ever experienced.
I'd say it's a must read if you love hard science fiction. It's a must read.
I will give it the caveat. You really have to be into some hard science fiction. If you had the kind of upbringing that I did with classic science fiction authors, again, Asimov, Bradbury, Clarke, Heinlein, if you were reading oh crap, what's his name? The Android's Dream of Electric Sheep.
Oh yeah, I know which one.
Philip K. Dick. If that was if those kinds of stories, I mean, I'm on one beer and now I can't remember Philip K. Dick. It's time to end this podcast. But if that's the kind of stuff that really lit you up when you started exploring the world of science fiction, I think you will find something refreshing in this book that brings you back to that kind of storytelling. And on that note, we're going to be switching gears next month to read. For me, it'll be rereading. I am shocked and appalled that I have started producing this podcast with an individual who I call friend who has not read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Who? Oh, me. Oh, yeah. Oh,
Andrew, wear your shame.
It's one of those things.
It's time to rectify this problem.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, in my defense, growing up, like it was one of those things where I had one thing and another, on my list to read. And then I ended up, the films came out and I was like, okay, I'm just going to ignore them. So I have very little of an inkling of the whole plot of this. So I'm extremely excited to get into this and just, plow through this, because this has been on my list for probably about 20 years. So, yeah. And let's see. Yeah, I'm just excited as all hell.
So
we're going to have a guest too.
Yes, we are going to have a guest, Ms. Laura Fagan, and it's appropriate that she's British.
Mm-hmm.
She's from the Great Britain.
So this should be great.
To talk about one of my all-time favorite voices in literature, bar none, Mr. Douglas Adams. Author of lines like, "It did this because it invariably delivered a cup full of liquid that was almost, but not quite, entirely unlike tea." An individual who can string together prose in the most creative ways possible. I wish I could vivisect my memories of The Hitchhiker's Guide out of my brain so I could reread it for the first time again with you. I am so jealous of the experience that you're about to have in reading this book. I can't stress that enough. So if you guys want to join us next month, we actually do have it, because Laura is going to be joining the show. We are going to be recording October 20th is when we're going to produce next month's Geek Book Club. You can join us for the live broadcast. You can shoot us messages on the Twitters, where you can find Andrew as @FatBroduce and I am @SomeGadgetGuy. I'll also have a link to this show and to the date for next month's show on my blog, SomeGadgetGuy.com. But of course, you can always find it here, youtube.com/JuanBagnell, or if you just search for the Geek Book Club, you'll find us there too. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We're not going to go through the entire trilogy of 5 books.
Yeah, that's a big caveat there.
We're only going to be reading the very first one, and I think that'll be enough. That'll be like 3 Body Problem on your own time, Andrew. You'll want to finish the rest of this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm already. I've gotten so many strange looks from people as I've talked about it and how they realize that I've never read it. So it's been intense.
Oh God, it's just they hung in the air they hung in the air exactly the same way that bricks don't. There's just so many. Like you say a movie, like every line of dialogue from like The Big Lebowski is practically quotable.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every single sentence of The Hitchhiker's Guide could be its own inside joke. I mean, it's like my wife and I with Simpsons references, where we can have entire conversations by quoting different moments of The Simpsons or Futurama. Yeah. We can also do that with The Hitchhiker's Guide.
Well, we got to make sure we have Laura say some of these lines in that awesome English, and the Irish accent.
I'm shocked that you didn't have her just like read the book to you with your penchant.
Ooh, well, don't worry. That'll be our homework assignment. No.
It's like, Laura, every day between 4 in the afternoon and 6 in the afternoon, I need you to read me The Hitchhiker's Guide. So,
but watch, but that's also like in the middle of the night for her. So it's a commitment.
I love it. This is going to be great. So, folks, thank you once again for joining us on the Geek Book Club. The 3rd episode, listed as episode 2 of the inaccurately numbered Geek Book Club. Join us next month for the Hitchhiker's Guide. This is a wonderful homecoming for me. I'm super excited to be sharing this book with you guys. And like I said, hit us up on the socials and help us out with some sharing if you guys also want to participate with an online book club and suggesting books that we can read in the future, especially books that at least one of us have not read yet, is going to be a great way to participate. Once again, I'm Juan Bagnell.
I'm Andrew Wallace.
And we will catch you all next month on the Geek Book Club.